Hello and welcome to Policy Matters, the podcast from Tyto, where we explore the intersection between policy and communications and the evolving role of media in shaping global tech policy. This series helps PR and communication leaders at tech companies understand how to engage with the media, build meaningful relationships, and craft stories that drive impact in a complex European and global political landscape.
In today's episode, we're joined by Chris Hilton, Director of Global Communications at Mozilla. Prior to his current role, Chris has over 2 decades of policy communications experience, including nearly half a decade as a political director of communications within the Canadian government. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, you've helped position Mozilla as one of the world's biggest organizations campaigning for an open internet. That's very much an ethical position as well as a business one. So I suppose we'd really like to open by asking, what are some of the challenges of aligning a societal cause with broader corporate communications?
Yeah, I think it's really at the core of what Mozilla does. We like to say we have a double bottom line with a mission-based goal and a revenue-based goal because we both have a consumer product and goals for making the internet better. So that is a unique space in the marketplace, certainly, and like you said, presents both opportunities and challenges. I think from the opportunities perspective, it allows us to make decisions and to work sort of across the tech space, from comms to policy to even the way we engineer our products, in a way that is designed to make the internet a better place for people and ensure that the internet remains open and accessible. From the challenges is when you're building a consumer product, you're not always thinking only about what the customer wants, but other sort of criteria and responsibilities that you have as an organization. And that presents some different challenges than if you were building just a straight tech, a piece of technology that was about generating revenue and value for shareholders. So that's sort of where the crux of the challenge is, but it's also the opportunity for us. And the reason why so many people at Mozilla are really passionate about what we do is that we get to make decisions and grapple with challenges that are not only one-dimensional, and that we can see out that mean more than just what it means for Mozilla, but what it means for the internet at large. So that's a fun and exciting place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, I suppose lots of bigger tech organizations are, I'm not going to use the phrase jumping on the bandwagon, but they are really keen on getting involved in this conversation and coming across as authentic. I did use it. But sometimes this messaging where there is the ethical cause and that aligns really well with the business purpose, that can come across as a phrase I like to call purpose washing. Some people call it, inauthentic grassroots movements. So how do you build something that feels authentic, is embedded in the organization's DNA, and doesn't come across as that sort of purpose washing?
Yeah, it's a challenge we face all the time. I think one of the easier ways to do it is that we've been around for 25 years as a responsible tech organization. So we've built up trust and a brand identity that is both understood and believed. But we do face a lot of organizations. If you look at something like data, many tech organizations out there say phrases like "we don't sell your data" or "we don't transfer your data." And perhaps don't live up to the full scope of that standard. Whereas we struggle even saying that point because sell and data have a really broad meaning on the internet and what that means. And so that really high standard that we have to hold ourselves to makes it a little bit difficult from a communication perspective, but also lends legitimacy. Because when we say a moment like that, something like that, it's very easy both to demonstrate through our open source background, everyone sort of can see everything that we do, and live up to that standard under scrutiny. So even when we're challenged, we can sort of showcase that we're living up to that standard. The access or the avenue to revenue through mission-based communications is always concerning. Right, and it's a really easy path that tech companies often abuse and sort of go down. We always look at it is there's a standard that we want to set and hold ourselves to, and hopefully others will be judged by the standard that we have. And so that's the way we look at it. Certainly, I also think internally, it's a challenge for us to push against that standard, right? Because we do want to build products that people use that are like that advance sort of how people are on the internet every day. And sometimes the easier way isn't to do with the highest standards. And that's a tension that exists, and one that we interact with every day.
Yeah, and Chris, I find this. You use the phrase standards and the standards that Mozilla hold themselves to. I mean, that's really important. Obviously, a lot of companies will look to the regulators to decide what those standards are. It sounds like Mozilla has more of a core, but obviously regulators are different depending on which jurisdictions you're on. So when it comes to talking about those messages, sort of developing that policy communication strategy, how do you develop a strategy which is coherent and also recognizes policy and media differences in those different jurisdictions and those different geographies?
Yeah, I think for us, our biggest markets essentially are the United States, Germany, and France. And so the regulatory environment, especially when it comes to technology, are vastly different in those countries and the way they look at it. I think what we try to do is set and stick to sort of like what our core message is and the basic tenets of what we want to do, and then adapt them to um, audiences in a way that makes sense. There are, Europe is farther along on creating tech policy than almost anywhere else in the world, right? Like they're developing and participating in creating new regulatory environments for technology. Generally a good thing, sometimes a challenging thing, but there's action and momentum. So we can be a bit more aggressive in participating in the political discourse around technology in Europe. In the United States, it moves a little bit slower, especially at the federal level. And so that means sort of a limiting of what we can do. It's also at understanding the more partisan conversations that happen in the United States as it relates to technology policy, despite tech policy being one of the few sort of bipartisan areas that actually has some agreement in the United States. It still moves relatively slowly. So, that was a long-winded way of saying, yes, it has to be differentiated. And I think it's understanding the political and bureaucratic environment where you're operating, and then taking your core tenets and adapting those messages to them. And that's what we try and do.
Do you find it difficult sometimes to square that strong value-based identity around openness and privacy with the markets or the jurisdictions where there isn't perhaps that alignment with those core values?
Actually, I don't think we find it difficult. I think what we find difficult sometimes is the different messages that other technologies can send in different parts of the world. I think Mozilla is pretty consistent. What we say in Germany is what we'll say in Japan, is what we'll say in the United States, right? Whereas you can look at American-based tech companies, or even European-based tech companies, will tailor their message to the governments that they're talking to in hopes of getting the best outcome.
From a commercial point of view.
Yeah, there's always been an ongoing debate, for example, about the idea that regulation stifles innovation, right? Like that's in Europe, it's a talking point that especially U.S. tech companies use quite often. Um, that is at the very best thin, and at the worst just a crass use of what that means. So that's a perfect example of Mozilla is always for a smart, sensible regulatory environment in the United States and Europe and everywhere. And we think that can be done without stifling innovation. That doesn't mean that regulation is the be all and end all of solving all the problems that exist in the technology world. Companies have to have responsibility. But it puts us at odds in different places with different companies where we should be sort of in the same place on some pieces. And so we definitely find that challenging.
So let's talk a little bit about how you do engage in that discourse. As a communication specialist, tell us a bit more about just the role that media relations plays in building, communicating, and engaging your audiences with your policy positions.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways that we try to look at it. Is our policy team spends a lot of thought and time and effort engaging directly with legislators and politicians, right? That's a core piece of advocacy that's necessary, and I think all companies sort of do. Um, we can't spend to the levels of others when it comes to sort of more direct lobbying, both from a human resource and a financial resource piece. So that means that we have to participate in issues-based communications that can influence public debates. Um, our team thinks about it a lot as how do we put our messages out into the world that are relevant to political debates of the world in that day. Just this week, or recently there's been a number of companies that have created browsers, new browsers that have come to the world that have a significant amount of AI sort of embedded to them and how they're used. Our ability to comment on that from a regulatory perspective and to highlight the concerns around data privacy, around authenticity, around commercial challenges is what allows us to be in the political arena and have that commentary. So we really try to understand both the commercial activities that are happening and recognize what that means for a political environment. Ultimately, especially at the political level, speaking to constituents and driving awareness for constituents of issues that are important to us is a really critical and interesting one. We think about an example would be digital IDs in Europe, where the premise of digital IDs has some merit, but the implementation can be challenging in certain ways. Like, could it lead to the erosion of encryption, as an example? The policy communications conversation about that is different because on one side, it's easy to talk about the harms that can happen in the internet. That relates to gambling or child exploitation, and to use that as a lever to create a legislative environment that is beneficial for the government. So those are longer policy communications that we have to be present in, that we have to take the time to have the words and talk about. And so engaging in those in the appropriate way is what allows our policy team to also showcase the positions that we have as an organization.
So in the simplest possible terms, if you can engage with media and tell a compelling narrative and give them something interesting to write about, it just really enables those direct conversations with policymakers that are fundamental for Mozilla's purpose.
I think that's right. One of the things that I don't know if everyone on these conversations would say, but is that for me, and one that I talk to our team, is that media aren't stakeholders for us. Media are avenues to speak to the general public. There's avenues to speak to constituents, right? I think communicators sometimes get lost in thinking about how can I sell X, Y, or Z story to media, and we really work hard to think about why is this story important to people, and is media going to be interested in that avenue through? And there's a nuance there, but it's a pretty important one for me in thinking about. I never allow our team to put like decks together that have stakeholders being media, because media are a mechanism to reach our stakeholders in the way that we want, our community in the way that we want.
So how do you see things changing with the massive increase in social media, with the rise of podcasts, the return of newsletters, all of the kind of increasingly fragmented ways that people are getting their news, getting their information, being influenced? How much is your strategy changing, or how do you engage with those different types of formats?
Yeah, I think it has to change, right? From when I started my career, which is, as you said, Jack, almost 20 years ago now, which is frightening when someone says it out loud.
Sorry.
In a call, is the idea that earned was newspapers, right? Or earned was the stories that came out in the morning, to right now a recognition that people do take in their media in a variety of different ways. So we started to think a lot about community, and that's a wide term that means a lot of things to different people. But for us, it means that are there audiences out there that are engaged, that we can engage with in a more dynamic and real way? Be that on, there's a lot of passionate community members from Mozilla in places like Discord and Reddit who have both positive and negative things. So are we thinking about parts of our community strategy that are engaging with those groups? Can we work with influencers and stakeholders who have their own audiences and have them, work alongside Mozilla on issues that we want, both paid and earned, looking at the social side of those pieces? And then are we maximizing our own channels? I think is the key there. And that's one where we need to continue to do better. But if you look at audiences, we recently started a LinkedIn newsletter, which sounds super boring when you say it out loud like that. But actually, we've been able to grow it to almost 40,000 people in a few months, and are producing engaging content. And from a policy communications perspective, that social media platform, LinkedIn, is one where regulators sit, where audiences that we want to talk to sit, and where thought leaders have some more. So like making sure that you're considering all of these areas. You still have to balance, executive leaders and companies still want that, more high profile earned positioning for sure. That still has to be a part of the suite that you do. But if you're only focused on that, you're just missing so much of the audience that's out there, and where to go.
Yeah. So it sounds like your position is that these kind of diversifying and fragmenting communications channels create a more kind of inclusive and authentic environment. But are there risks to that? What's on the flip side that they can be used for misinformation, that they just make it noisier, that they make it a lot harder for organizations to build their strategies because there's just so much out there?
Yeah, I think there's certainly risk. There's a couple of risks that I see it as sort of as you define it there. The misinformation is one. We're fortunate that we work for an organization that sort of live inside a space where there's less direct misinformation about the work that we do. What I see sometimes is the amplification of minority viewpoints. So the people who yell the loudest sometimes take up the most time with internal teams, with executives, with understanding what that is. And so part of your role as a communications team is to properly locate what that feedback is, because the feedback's real. It can be very loud. It can be immediate, and to balance what that feedback is in terms of executing the strategy and whether or not you should change as it relates to the silent majority, which is most
not get distracted.
That's right. Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard to do, but it's one thing that we certainly focus at. Also, from Mozilla's perspective, I work very closely with our marketing teams and others. If you think of paid spend, if you think of paid marketing, the paid communications that exist out there, we are in a field of against companies that are gigantic in comparison to the budgets that they have out into the world. So, when you're communicating about issues that are relevant to Meta and to Google and to Apple, you can't compete in terms of volume. So you really have to be focused on making sure that your core messages are unique and can break through. And so we spend a lot of time doing that by looking at the channels, right, and understanding what that looks like.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there about the value that the communications team can bring to the policy teams, to the other departments that are focused on different aspects of this. So you talked about working with the marketing team. You must work with the government affairs team, the legal team, the corporate communications team. How can comms professionals in that sort of intersection make sure they're working effectively with those teams and really kind of show how they can bring value as a communication specialist?
What I would always suggest is understand the business, right? Be business strategists as much as you are a communication strategist. You can have impact across the organization if you understand the business and then can slot in where the work that you do as a communications professional fits into the goals that the business has. If you're only coming at it from this is what is good for communications, I think it's harder to feel like an actual partner within the organization. In policy comms, that becomes even more challenging, right? Because communications team members are always cost centers anyways, and so there is always a battle to justify your existence. That's necessary and important. That tension should exist, but you have to recognize saying this is important is not enough. You have to show why what you do makes an impact, both positive or negative, if it wasn't there for the business. And the better you understand that, the easier it is to sort of have that as those internal partners and build that the sort of whole of team work to move forward. I'm sure lots of people have had the sort of conversation where you have a communications opportunity and the first question you get asked is, well, what's the reach or what's the worth of this? And a line I probably use too often, but media relations has relations in it for a reason. That you can't only do communications when you need something. You have to be consistent sort of and always on and have that sort of drumbeat of engagement in order to, when you really need something, to go to be it earned media or to, influencers that you work with and ask them for support. You can't just do it as a one-off when it's only good for you. So
I love that, and I'm definitely going to steal that. So.
Feel free.
Thanks. So you must have had those moments though where you have a really clear recommendation on what's best for the reputation of the business and advancing that strategy, but you have the policy team or the legal team going, no, we definitely can't do that. We have to do it this way. How do you kind of resolve those differences?
Of course. I think that's probably right. I think your comms team has to be more aggressive and willing to take risks than your policy team, probably. And so the conversation between the two, finding a middle ground, is really positive. With the policy team, it's I think where we fall into sometimes, and I understand the challenge, is the really partisan ramifications if you are vocal on an issue, is that you'll alienate one side or the other side. I like to think, and again, and I think all these things that I say often, and I realize I say these often, but it is
I'm
that
going to steal them all. It's fine.
Yeah.
we should be political, not partisan. It is good to be political, right? Like that should be the goal of an organization like Mozilla. We should be participating in political debates and having real discussions about political issues. That's important. We should try to avoid being partisan, because that's good when it's good and is really bad when it's bad, right? The challenge, or where that tension comes, is that it's hard to separate political and partisan sometimes, because they become one and the same. Especially working in the United States, they become one and the same a little bit too often. So you have to have sort of the courage and the belief in the things that you're doing to stand up and have those conversations. That being said, when it comes down to it, comms shouldn't drive strategy, right? And what I mean by that is we advise on strategy, we input into strategy. But if you're thinking about, well, what will the comms look like while making business decisions, you're not making good business decisions. I think the whole organization has to decide this is the best business decision, and then comms and policy, legal, and others come and input on, here are the potential negatives, the positives, the risk to brand, and then sort of decide how to execute. When I find you get into trouble, it's if you start with, well, how will this look from a comms perspective before a business decision is made. It's never a good place to be.
And Chris, I love that idea of starting from a business decision and then working out how we can supplement that with the comms and with the influence. Obviously, you've been on the other side as well. You've had a role in government as well as the private sector. And they must be different. There must be some quite big differences in the approaches they take, because there is no, I guess, starting business decision that you then have to sort of manage. And there is a lot of the politics becoming partisan because of the natural way that we do politics.
I worked in the Canadian government, and we had every day. When the House is sitting, there's question period, which is like question time in the United Kingdom, right? In Canada, it's every day, not just Wednesdays. So we would always hate it when policy would be created as the answer to a question in question time, right? Like that was bad. That was where the worst from a communications and policy perspective happened. You never liked that. I think from the government on the inside, you have to remember, especially at the political levels, those staffers, that communications job is almost often number one to ensure the government or your representative gets reelected, stays is home to their constituents, understands what that is, and then second is sort of like the government can move forward. And if you can do that the way that's good for the country, that's the right thing to do, and it's the best when that works out. But they're making decisions a lot of the time based on what is the, I don't want to say path of least resistance, but what is the smartest path to continuing in power, right? When you get towards, especially when the governments get towards the end of their lifetime, as all governments do, you see that even more. That they worry about preservation as opposed to good policy, and you get in trouble. From a comms perspective, it works best when the policy is strong, when it's good policy work, and what that looks like. I'm in New York right now, and it's coming towards the end of a mayoral election in New York. That's been quite unique. And what you see is both the sort of Mr. Mamdani has, the upstart, interesting communication style, and he's great at all that. But his core policy tenets, what he wants to talk about, I think is the reason why he's being so successful. He's both legitimate and honest and hitting at the issue of things that are really important. And from a policy communication perspective, then it gets easy. It's easy if you're talking about issues that are important to people, you do it in a way that's straightforward and understanding from the political side, and there's some earnestness to how you do that. I think politicians in general underestimate the intelligence and good sense that the constituents have in general. People can suss out that when you're just in it for you to a degree, and sometimes it takes too long to get there, unfortunately. But I think there is some good sense there, and so supporting that is the way I always looked at it.
And that kind of brings us back to that purpose washing point at the beginning, isn't it? Where you're not just putting out communications because it sounds good. There has to be some underlying, actually quite deep policy thought behind it, because ultimately, if you don't have that intellectual foundation, you do kind of get found out, both in government and in the corporate world as well.
I certainly think so. Yes.
Yeah, I'm really interested in pace. So, one of the things that we hear a lot in the UK, I suspect it's the same in North America and pretty much everywhere in the world, the pace of government is so slow compared to the world of business and the private sector. I mean, do you think that plays out in communications and the way that you do external affairs? I mean, having been in both of those situations, have you noticed a quickening of the pace since moving over to the private sector?
I think the pace at which businesses want to move is always faster than the pace at which governments want to move. Right? That's just a fundamental challenge. And for policy communications, one of the real critical difficulties is you don't see it's such a lagging response to the work that you do often. That if you build up work here, it could be 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, 2 years before sort of the policy sees in the way that you want. And I understand why, especially like senior executives, they have a limited amount of time to do things and to convince them, like, why am I talking about this when we know it's not going to change for a significant amount of time? I'll use an example in the UK, Jack, is the Digital Markets Act, is a piece of regulatory movement that's really important to us. And it feels like it's moving very, very slow. Slower than we'd want, slower than our executives want, slower than the business needs it to move, but it is moving. And so figuring out how to explain that balance to your teams is important, and the necessary need to continue the drumbeat of communications while this process happens, right, is important. But that's always going to be the way, especially in tech. Tech is always going to move faster than government. It should be that way. You look at the EU AI Act that was essentially, they started drafting it in 2020, right? And that piece of legislation is, while not outdated, cannot keep up with the pace of change at AI. There's just no way for governments to keep up with that pace of change. They're not built to do that. It's the boring of hardwood, right? It goes very slow. And so there is a responsibility, especially from a comms professional, to translate how that pace means to what the work you're doing and why things were connected to where you get to. And that's just part of the job, for sure.
It's finding that middle way, isn't it, between the slowness of the legislation and the fast pacedness of the business. I find this discussion fascinating, the difference between government and private sector. We've talked a lot about the differences, but tech is becoming such a hot political and policy issue at the moment. Do you think that difference in communications, that difference in culture is narrowing, is going to narrow even further, or are they going to stay gulfs apart because of the nature of how they work?
I mean, I think as tech continues to become even more inherently political, the use of technology is for political gains and means. It narrows, right? Like, that's the way you look at it. It is technology speech in the way that it was 30 years ago, right? Like, you look at the ability for people to participate in political speech is so different, so radically different than what it was. And so bringing those two things together, I think they will continue to coalesce. And then the blurring of the lines between governments and technology leaders, the influence that big technology leaders have on the regulatory process is real. Like, it's real, and it's not just these big bad American tech firms, which I think positives and negatives from both sides. What you're seeing now is European firms doing the same thing. If you look at in France, at a company like Mistral recognizes that they need support and engagement with their government in order to play in a field against larger American companies. They're using these levers to ensure that their business successes are there, sometimes to the detriment of good public policy. And that's just, I think, going to continue. It's hard to see it going back the other way.
You see this role as a policy communications specialist only growing in importance in the next few years?
Yeah, I do. I don't even think this role existed 10 years ago, right? Someone who said, I do policy communications. And when you ask people what that means, it probably means a lot of different things for a lot of different organizations and sort of where that balance is. So I do think it will continue to grow. I think in technology, especially, the coordination between the business and technological goals and the policy team, and also with policy communications, that becomes more and more critical because governments are regulating in ways that can be negative to both. It can be negative to technology companies, and they're using, in Europe they use more often a regulatory environment. It feels like in the United States they're using a judicial, litigious environment, right? Like in the way to change change the way technology companies work. So communicating around those is really important. Engaging directly around those is really important, and that's just going to continue. The role of a policy comms person is interesting. It's not the same as corporate comms, right? It's not the same as product comms. You have different goals, and highlighting, recognizing those goals, and especially internal in an organization, protecting the resources, the headcount, the support for that piece of the business is an interesting struggle and a balance when there's pressures on budgets and things like that.
How can you do that? How can you demonstrate success? How can you show that you're creating an impact?
I think there's a couple ways. You have to look at the long game for sure, and show that over time that engagement and work that you do sort of does move the needle from a policy perspective. I think it also goes back to understanding and communicating how policy specifically impacts the business, but how policy is impacted by using communications, by using direct engagement, by using communities, and all those pieces together. Yeah. Like how that work is moving forward, sort of the goals that you have from a political perspective as an organization, and that's the key. It's also where does it sit in terms of the organization is something that I think many companies continue to work through. Is it part of the marketing function? Is it part of the legal function? Should it be a standalone organization? I'm not sure what the right answer is. Probably depends on the size of the organization. I think that the key is not seeing it as a side of the desk activity, a nice to have, yeah. Right? And so making sure that there is a clear understanding throughout the organization that this is a core component of successful strategy and drives business goals.
It's just a fascinating career, but also a fascinating time to be in policy communications in the tech sector, given how things are rapidly changing, right?
It is. It's a really fun place to be. And I get to work for an organization that, sort of like I said at the beginning, big mission driven is fun. You get to actually struggle with decisions internally and have real conversations about what is best for the internet, what's best for users, what's best for people, and not just what's best for revenue, right? And there is nothing wrong with organizations being focused on revenue. We are as well. We have a commercial product that's necessary. But the ability to actually make decisions that are about more than sort of just that one bottom line is fun, and it allows from a policy communications and just a communications in general to participate in so many more things that you probably wouldn't get to. We get to say yes a lot, so that's great.
Brilliant. Well, look, Chris, thank you so much for being here. It's been a fascinating conversation. We're really excited to see where policy comms takes us and see where the tech landscape evolves. But Chris Hilton, Director of Global Communications at Mozilla, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Policy Matters, part of the Without Borders podcast series from Tyto, the only PR and communications agency built to scale tech companies faster across Europe.